You may recall back in week 3, Halevi's philosopher referring to something called the active intellect. Well, here is where you're actually going to find out what that is. What we need to understand here is the way our medieval thinkers understood the structure of the universe. Basically, we need to know some medieval cosmology. And though it may not sound much like it to us moderns, this was the cutting-edge science of its day. Now let's begin with the ancient Greek picture of the universe. According to this picture, the Earth is at the center of the universe, and it's surrounded by 9 concentric spheres that are transparent and that contain all the planets and the stars, all the heavenly bodies. Now, these spheres that contain these bodies all revolve around the Earth, which is why we can see movement in the heavens. But what causes the motion of these spheres? For Aristotle, the answer was the first cause, or the prime mover, which for our Jewish rationalists is identified as God. So it's God who causes the motions of the spheres. Think back to Maimonides' argument for the existence of God. In effect, he argues that God is this first cause of the universe. However, on this Aristotelian picture, since the world was eternal, there was no need to account for how the world came about, since according to Aristotle it didn't. It's always been there. So he just needed to explain its motion, its movement. In order, therefore, to account for there being a world at all, our medievals had to graft an extra element onto Aristotle's picture, an element that actually originated from a completely different worldview known as Neoplatonism. Now, a reminder here that the medievals didn't realize that this wasn't part of Aristotle's picture. They thought, mistakenly, that this Neoplatonism was Aristotelian. The reason for this was that they had a book called The Theology of Aristotle and were unaware that the book was actually a selection from a work written by Plotinus called the Enneads. So, what we have here is a theory that puts together Aristotelianism and Neoplatonism. But our thinkers didn't know that. They thought this was all Aristotle. Now, according to this theory of Neoplatonism, the world begins with something called the One. The first thing that existed was the One, and the One is beyond being. We are all beings. We are physical beings. We are imperfect beings. But the One, which is beyond being, is perfect, non-physical, a perfect unity. Sound familiar? Should sound awfully like Maimonides' view of God. So it's unsurprising that this view was so attractive to our medieval thinkers. They could easily identify this One with God. How, though, do we go from the One to our world? Well, we do so through a series of so-called emanations. And here is where things get a little strange to our modern ears. What happens is that this perfect One contemplates itself or thinks about itself. When it does so, it has a thought. And this thought is a separate existence. It effectively emanates this thought that then exists as an intellect. So the One emanates an intellect. And now we have two things. We have the One, and we have this first separate intellect. But this separate intellect is also a non-physical thinking thing. And it has two things to think about. On the one hand, the intellect thinks about the One, or thinks about God. And when it does so, it emanates another intellect. But this first separate intellect can also think about itself, and when it does so, it emanates a sphere. So, the intellect thinks about God. It emanates an intellect. It also thinks about itself, and it emanates a sphere. But now we have three intellects. At this point, we have God, our first cause. We have our first separate intellect, and that intellect emanates another intellect and emanates a sphere. And the point is that this process goes on because our second separate intellect does the same. It thinks about God and emanates a further intellect, and it thinks about itself and emanates a further sphere. And so on and so forth until one arrives at the lowest sphere, the Earth, and the lowest intellect, which is the active intellect. Basically, each sphere is governed by an intellect. The intellect governs the sphere beneath it, so to speak. And the intellect that governs the Earth is our old friend, the active intellect, which also, by the way, is sometimes called the agent intellect. So we end up with this picture. And this, approximately at least, is how Maimonides and Gersonides understood the structure of the universe. It is a universe made up of concentric physical spheres, but those spheres have, so to speak, attached to them thinking conscious intellects that govern them, that in effect contain the laws that apply in that sphere. Now note, not everybody was impressed with this picture. Judah Halevi himself actually makes fun of it. As he writes, when Aristotle asserts that he was conscious of his existence, one may consistently expect that a sphere should emanate from him. And when he asserts that he recognized the prime cause, an intellect should emanate. Basically saying, look, this stuff about thinking about yourself and thinking about the prime cause emanating things, why doesn't Aristotle emanate a sphere when he thinks about himself and an intellect when he thinks about God? Halevi doesn't think much more of this picture than maybe we do. Nonetheless, such was the picture of our rationalists, which we will consolidate on and expand upon with a brief review exercise.